the new SEC.
Conference Championship Week. Welcome to the new SEC podcast. We have made it. Nothing but potential champions are playing this week. I'm Randall Ledet Jr. We got Hunter Zeisman here. What are the feelings for Conference Championship Week?
It's interesting because it's important for a lot of teams. There's some teams on the outside that are trying to get in with a Conference Championship Week. It's bittersweet because we only got 9 games on Saturday, but it's football all the same. So I'm excited for it. We got some good ones to talk about, and a lot of playoff implications from them too.
I don't know about you, but I feel like I'm in this tornado of college football right now. I mean, college football playoff rankings came out last night. Before that, I think there's a 3-day debate about South Carolina or Alabama. Then there was a debate about Miami. Some people are throwing BYU in that discussion. The Big 12 feels disrespected. The ACC feels disrespected. Jim Phillips is speaking out more than I've ever seen him speak out when it comes to the ACC. We got South Carolina putting together 5 slides as to why they should get in. We got Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin has been making a case for Ole Miss to get in the past 3 weeks. And then, like I said, the rankings came out last night. It's been portal season, flip season. It's so hard to focus, but the main thing to focus on is that there's football on the field, and we got, like you said, a ton of great championships. Headline here, at least on the new SEC podcast, with the SEC championship. Georgia, Texas, going to be taking place at 4 p.m. here in Atlanta, Georgia. Some could say it's a home game for Georgia, but Texas travels well too. I mean, amidst all the stuff going on in college football, where is your head at? Because I am all over the place.
Yeah, I mean, I'm more I'm thinking about where teams are going to be placed after conference championships. I'm trying to make sense of it all because there's really no clarity on certain things. Does playing in a conference championship game lock you in? Does will Georgia drop it with a loss to an away game, or will they stay in a home team spot? Will Texas drop to an away game, or will they stay in a home team spot? I feel like I'm trying to wrap my head around it all. But all we can do is watch now at this point, because I think they've made up their minds as far as what teams have potential shots and what they need.
When I think about this weekend, right? If you're an Alabama fan, you are watching the ACC championship game on Saturday night very closely. Most likely you never did like Clemson. This is not the weekend to start pulling for them.
Pony up. Yeah. Alabama fans definitely looking for SMU to win that one. I mean, the committee in the rankings show mentioned that if SMU loses this game, there's really not a guarantee 100% that they're going to be in. If it's a bad loss where Clemson wins by 2 scores, 3 scores, that could still drop SMU out. But really on the outside looking in, Alabama is probably the only team that is watching the game closely. They're the only one, I think, from the outside looking in that has a decent shot of getting in should something happen. But everybody else controls their destiny. Clemson can get in with a win. Penn State and Oregon are both going to be in. Georgia and Texas are both going to be in. UNLV could get in with a win. So really Alabama's that only team sitting at home kind of with their, hands in their lap, hoping for the best. I think Miami's out of the question, and same with South Carolina and Ole Miss.
It definitely looks like that. And I think I'm going to throw you a curveball. This just came to me. What if SMU loses and they bump Indiana out? Both those teams have 1 loss. Both those teams have a weaker strength of schedule compared to some other conferences. SMU plays an extra game. Maybe they look at it and say, hey, we're just putting in Indiana in because they have 1 loss and they haven't played that extra game. Maybe we give the nod to SMU.
It could be. I think it's tough because with that, I think that they would have put Indiana behind Alabama. When I was watching the screen, I was like, is there a chance where they put Indiana behind Alabama or behind one of these teams that's kind of vying for a spot? And they didn't, which gives me the indication that I don't think Indiana will go out regardless. So I think it's SMU have been having to make that debate against Alabama.
Yep. I'm right there with you there. And so for this episode, this is episode 30. We've made it to conference championship weekend. We're going to give you a preview of Georgia versus Texas round 2, taking place here in Atlanta, Georgia, where I'm based here in the Southeast. We're going to go through talking about some of the other conference championships at a high level. And then we'll talk through just kind of our CFP reactions, what the bracket looks like, and what that means for the final rankings that are coming out next week, post-championship weekend. If you haven't already, please subscribe. This is a great show. If you want to make it easier for you to find it, follow, subscribe here. But, let's just get straight to it. Round 2, SEC championship, new SEC podcast preview. What do you expect, or what are some of the themes you're thinking about when it comes to Texas versus Georgia round 2?
Yeah, it's one of those things where we don't have a whole lot of data points in the history to look at of teams that have to play twice, but we know it's a hard thing to do. We've seen it with Alabama and Georgia in years past. It's a tough thing to beat a team twice. Washington did it last year twice against Oregon. Texas, from what history would say, I think that Texas has the upper hand because of having to beat a team twice. But I don't think I can look at the last game and really think that this game will go anything like that. I think that Georgia's dropped back a little bit. Texas maybe got a little better. So I think we're going to see two different teams on the field than what we saw a couple weeks ago.
Yeah, it's really a possibility for us to see two different teams than what we saw on the field a couple weeks ago. And you talked about it, like most teams struggle to beat a team twice. We've seen this scenario a little bit a couple times when it comes to the SEC championship, like when Georgia had to won the SEC championship and then Alabama won the national championship, right? A little different scenario, but still two teams playing again. From this particular game, the keys for Georgia last time they played was getting the ball on their side of the field, forcing turnovers, and being able to drive quickly from a short side of the field to be able to score. Will they have that same turnover margin? That's kind of the main question. And will they be able to put Quinn Ewers kind of in fits like they did last game?
Yeah, it was an ugly start to the game on both sides. I mean, Texas offense was pretty abysmal to start out the game. Georgia didn't, do anything to capitalize on it at first. Carson Beck throwing a couple picks. Texas having 3 turnovers in the first half. So it was just really ugly to start, but it was Georgia's defense setting them up, like you said, with the short side of the field. If Georgia could get that same defensive pressure on, then I think they could absolutely do it. I don't think that Quinn Ewers has gotten any better against that level of pressure. But Georgia's defense since that game has kind of dropped off.
Yeah.
I was looking at, statistically before that game, they were only giving up 16 points per game before this. After the game, now they're at about 26 points per game. So the defense has fallen off a little bit. We saw the Georgia Tech game. So I don't know if they have that same level. UMass game. I don't know if they have that same level of defensive pressure that's going to look like what it did in the last one.
Yep. And look, they're getting a little bit of extended rest. We saw last week that was off of a short rest, playing on Friday, previously played on the Saturday before that. When it comes to what Texas can do to kind of go against this defense that appears to be, falling back, can Travion Wisner and maybe putting in Arch Manning to run the ball could play a key role and doing similar to what we saw Georgia Tech do against this defense, which is be run heavy and use the run to establish the pass.
Yeah, I mean, Texas has to be watching the film, looking at what Haynes King did, 400, 100 on the ground, 300 in the air. And in my eyes, it looks like Arch Manning would be the guy to provide more of that look. Travion Wisner, like last time they played, Georgia's defense held Texas to like nothing on the ground. Yep. I mean, they were like 1 yard per carry. They couldn't get anything going. Texas's rushing has only gotten better. Travion Wisner, I mean, is as good as any as of late. Against Kentucky, against A&M, over 150 against Kentucky, 186 against A&M. I think that they'll be able to run a lot better in this one because of how they've improved and how Georgia's regressed. But if Georgia can do that again and shut down the run, then I think Texas is in for it.
Yeah, I think Texas could definitely be in for it if they are able to shut down the run and kind of create those turnovers like they did last game. When we think about some of the key players in this game, and for people that are listening, by the way, the spread is 48, or the spread is 2.5, sorry, and the over under is 49. But when we think about some of the key players in this game, outside of the main guys, who comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I think it's Jahdae Barron. I think he's kind of the key guy in this game. We've seen Carson Beck be extremely turnover prone. In the last couple games, he's dialed it back, but he's still third in the country in picks. Jahdae Barron picked him off in that game last time they played. He hasn't given up a single touchdown. He's the number 1 graded cornerback via PFF in college football. I think that you combine what he's doing from the cornerback position with the struggles that Georgia's had from the wide receiver position, getting open, consistency in the pass catching position, plus Carson Beck's mistake proneness, should that come back. I think that he's the key player to watch in this one.
I'm right there with you. Jahdae's had an incredible season. You talked about it, number 1 PFF graded cornerback. If we have the graphic posted up here, and he's kind of been the anchor for that secondary for Texas. That defensive line has also been pretty strong for them. When we look on the other side for Georgia, Malachi Starks was kind of a guy who came into the season, I think, first team all SEC preseason. We saw that amazing pick he had in week 1 against Clemson. Defensive backs are not expected to have a lot of tackles. 50 tackles is a very high number. And so he's getting involved in just about every play out there when it comes to, making sure that there's no big plays happening on this defense for Georgia.
Yeah, they're both, between the two guys there, they're both high motor guys running around the field. I mean, Malachi Starks is going to be involved a lot. It's interesting to see how much he'll come down. Quinn Ewers, should he be the guy to start? He doesn't have a super deep depth of target. They let their playmakers get the ball and then make something happen with it in space. If he's effectively tackling the linebackers as well, that shuts down a little bit of the passing game that Texas early on in the last matchup couldn't get going because of the same reason.
Absolutely, right. And we haven't really given the love to like some guys like Jalen Walker and Mikael Williams, both guys that are, first, second round grade guys when it comes to the NFL draft. Speaks a lot to their abilities in college. They're going to have a tough test slowing down Contravion Wisner. I think when the season started, the story was Jadon Blue, but Contravion Wisner's kind of been that guy. 172 yards per game, 5.8 yards per carry. I mean, he has been cooking up defenses, and we saw it against A&M, and we saw it against Florida as well. How do you feel about that matchup with him versus this defensive line, led by Mikael Williams and Walker?
The Georgia defense from more than a couple weeks ago, I would say, yeah, Georgia's defense will continue to do what they do. But if you're just looking at their last 3 games, Tennessee, UMass, and Georgia Tech, they're outside the top 100 in rush defense. They're kind of back of the pack when it comes to stopping these guys. Sure, it includes Dylan Sampson, but you got UMass. Haynes King, the quarterback, being the leading rusher in the Georgia Tech game. So right now, the run defense hasn't shown me that they are who they used to be. So I do like Texas running the ball often in this game and showing something different, because I think that Georgia's offense performed so poorly early on in that game that if Texas had something going, the game would have looked completely different. Momentum would have built. In this one, I think that Texas will get it going much more.
It would seem like it, right? Because if you take away those turnovers, and that's a big if, right? That was kind of the big crux for Texas in that game. And then for Georgia, we always talked about Carson Beck this season. He's been playing much better football from a turnover perspective. His receivers have not been helping him as much from, catching the pass perspective. Aaron Smith is, some people he's very favorable here in Georgia. For others, he might not be. But, if I'm Carson Beck, I feel like I'm doing my job. I'm kind of getting back warmed up. I might not watch football just for the sake of entertainment, but I watch a lot of film. And, when you think about what type of game he has to have to continue what he's doing, what do you expect to see?
Yeah, I think he needs to continue to play his game regardless of what's happening around him. It's, you have guys dropping the ball. I think Aaron Smith right now has the most drops in Power 4 football. No shade to him, but it's just what Carson Beck's having to deal with this season, and a big change from his receiving core last year. Second most drop passes in Power 4 ball for him as a whole. So I think if he can continue to just play his game and let those things happen, if it happens, it happens, but you can't let it impact you at the quarterback position and trying to do too much, squeezing in tight windows. What he's done the past couple of weeks and not being turnover prone following the Florida game, I think if he can continue that, then he should be fine.
Yeah. I'm right there with you. From a between the lines, as we say, we looked at these teams in terms of the spread, right? We talked about it being 2.5 against the spread. Georgia's 3-9 and Texas is 7-5. So a couple over under historicals for Texas. 4 overs have hit and 7 unders have hit. And for Georgia, 6 overs hit and 6 unders have hit. It's pretty even, at least for Georgia. For Texas, that stat's interesting given the competition they've played and maybe just how large some of these spreads have been. What are your thoughts on that? All these over-unders have been. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it has to do mostly with Georgia just keeping games too close. That they should have won by a lot. Florida, Kentucky, games that they win, but it's closer than probably it should have been. This one where they're underdogs, I don't know if it matters as much, but Texas has done a good job of covering and beating teams that they were supposed to beat. The one outlier being the Georgia game last time in Austin. I think that the over under for Texas is interesting. The unders hit because of the strong defense that they do have.
Yep. I'm right there with you. Just given the strong defense that they have there. One factor that we haven't talked about today that I think plays a role in my prediction and in this game is the experience that Kirby Smart brings to being in SEC championships. Obviously, this is Texas' first SEC championship. Sarkisian's probably been a part of a couple SEC championships as a former Alabama staffer. But when it comes to being the head coach, playing in this pressure, we're not head coaches, of course, but how much of a factor do you feel like experience plays for someone like Kirby, whose his main kryptonite has only really been Alabama?
Yeah, I think he's such a master of second half adjustments. And in a game like this, where it is keeping your guys level headed and not folding under pressure, it definitely matters. Now he's against a guy in Steve Sarkisian, who I don't think is going to have any troubles with that in his own regard. So there should have been another coach with maybe a little less tenure around the sport. It could be more of a factor, but I think both these guys are going to be ready for whatever comes at them.
I'm right there with you. I think both guys are going to be ready. I think, I give the nod to Kirby just from an experience perspective, just as a head coach. But it's not a far gap to where Sarkisian is in this game. I don't think it's enough of a factor for them to fully affect who wins the game. But Kirby, I think it definitely helps Kirby on his end.
Yeah, I mean, it's two great coaches. I think, both of these guys, we've seen SEC coaches talking about this game, and if you even want to be playing in it, they both know that the playoffs are around the corner. I think knowing that there's an opportunity for the loser of this game to be playing on the road, the winner getting a bye, the stakes are high in this one as opposed to, I think, some of the other conference games.
Absolutely. Like if there's any talk about these teams not caring about this game because they're both in the game, you're not a competitor as a person. Because when people like to compete, players like to compete, athletes like to compete, they play to win, right? And you want that first round bye. Although you know how I feel about the first round bye, to me, if you're playing your championship, like it kind of negates the bye. You're already playing an extra game of football. But if you have to play and you want to be a champion and you're in the spot to be a champion, you're going to go for that. And I think it does matter in terms of who gets that bye. We looked at it right now in terms of how the committee has ranked these teams, and it would put Georgia in a position where if nothing changed, they'd play Indiana in the first round at home, and then they would rematch with Texas in the second game. I personally don't think the committee would set it up where there's these opportunities for rematches for the third time or second time, but it is an interesting path in terms of what this game has on the line in terms of getting a home game as a at-large bid, getting the first round bye as a conference champion, and then who you match up with and where that puts you in terms of that second round game if you're at large.
It definitely matters. They're going to be playing hard for it. It's like we mentioned at the beginning of this one, it's tough to play a team twice. So, in this game in Atlanta, I think it'll be more of a neutral site game. I know it's right down the road from Georgia, but Texas fans are everywhere. I think it'll still kind of feel like a neutral site game. What are you thinking?
Yeah, I mean, look, there's an association called the Texas X's, and I see them everywhere. They have them here in Georgia where I live. They're obviously big in Texas. They're big in a ton of different markets across the nation. I like Georgia in this game again. I think that they're going to continue to build upon what this defense was able to do against Quinn Ewers and this team. I think it's a lot closer. I don't think Quinn has the same type of game. I would expect to see more arch in this game from a rushing perspective, but I don't think they're going to fully open up the playbook just given they're so close to the playoffs. I like Georgia in this game 28-24.
Okay. No, I like it. I think that Georgia does have some things to build upon. In this game, I think the key is whichever quarterback gets pressure on them. I think that will be the team to fall. There's two quarterbacks that both falter under pressure.
Mm-hmm.
The way that the defenses have progressed, I like Texas's defense being able to apply that pressure more than Georgia's. So I think Texas wins 34-27, punches the ticket as the 2 seed.
Okay.
In their first year in the SEC, winning an SEC championship.
We'll see, right? If we see the Georgia offensive line that we saw against Tennessee, I think Georgia can handle that pressure. If they can't, then maybe your prediction's right. But I like Georgia in this one, 28-24. And it'll be a fun one to see who ultimately gets that first round bye, gets the crown of being the SEC champion. Is it the former Big 12 team, or is it the creme de la creme of the SEC these days with Georgia?
Yeah, both will be playing. They're both going to be there, in the playoffs. A lot of teams though still vying for that playoff spot from outside the conference. Other conference championship games happening this weekend as well, not just that one.
Yeah, definitely some other conference championship games. We have a couple that are taking place on Friday night, a couple of the G5 games. I think the two main ones to watch there are going to be ultimately that Army versus Tulane matchup, and then that UNLV versus Boise State matchup.
Yeah. There's still some opportunity for Army to get in, supposedly per ESPN, around 7% if they win this game. And if UNLV wins, there's conversation around, does Army winning their conference championship game, should it be in a style point fashion? Could they get that G5 spot instead of UNLV, who beats Boise State? A lot of things need to happen for that, but these are the two games that will determine one playoff spot.
Yeah, and maybe that's the 21% difference we're seeing with UNLV versus Army is Army can make that jump if they win with style points compared to UNLV winning. The 28% is solely, of course, dependent upon UNLV winning their game and most likely Army losing. But a little bit of that comes with if Army just puts belt to ass on Tulane, for example, right? I don't think that's going to happen. I think Tulane's going to make it a close game. But if it does play out that way, I mean, it's an 11-1 or 12-1 conference champion from the American. Their only bad loss was to Notre Dame. It's a little bit recent in terms of how bad that loss was. I don't know if they jump Army over UNLV in that scenario where Boise State loses. Yeah. If UNLV is able to do something that no other team has been able to do this year and slow down Ashton Genty, that would be impressive, I will say.
Yeah, it's again, like we talked about with Texas and Georgia, playing a team twice is hard to do. Boise State took that close the first time. So, we'll see what happens with them in this one. So
Yeah,
yeah, some Friday night games are fun.
this should definitely be pretty fun. That one for Boise, they're favored by 4 in this one. And then for Tulane, they're actually favored by 5.5 in this one.
Yeah. Coming off of a loss to Memphis, but
Yeah.
Army has had a pretty weak schedule up to this point. Notre Dame being the only game that was really, really tough on there. And we saw how that one went. So
yeah, in terms of the American, Army didn't play Memphis this year either. So Memphis is sitting there at 10-2, recently ranked in the CFP as well. In terms of some of the other games around the conference championship slate, which ones interest you the most outside the SEC? Curious.
The ones that have playoff implications, like the Penn State Oregon game, is a good game for seeding purposes, but they're both going to get in pretty much regardless of what happens in this one. So I'm looking more at the Big 12 championship with Iowa State and Arizona State as a big one. 2 teams that aren't in the top 12. They're not in the top 14. So it's teams that didn't necessarily prove to be a top 12 team in the country.
Committee's eyes,
in the committee's eyes, but one of them will get a shot.
Yep. One of them will definitely get a shot. I personally think that, I would rank Arizona State maybe above an Ole Miss. I'm not saying that I'd put them above a South Carolina, but I'd probably put them above an Ole Miss. But nonetheless, based upon the way the championship format is set, or the playoff format is set, 5 conference champions, the top 5 highest ranked conference champions get a automatic playoff spot. And right now, the Big 12 is looking poised to get one of those spots. The 2 teams playing, we talked about it, Arizona State favored by 2.5 against Iowa State. Pesky Iowa State, led by Matt Campbell, still back in the race here, have an opportunity to ultimately make it to the playoffs. And then Arizona State, I think they have a little bit more star power. We talk about, Cam Scatabo, their running back, one of the top 10 running backs in the nation right now statistically. And then Sam Levitt, he's a freshman quarterback who's been balling out for them. Big win over BYU a couple weeks ago, and find themselves in a spot with Dillingham to potentially clinch the Big 12 there. It's a big one for sure.
Yeah, and I know both of these teams are probably rooting for UNLV to beat Boise State, so that way the Big 12 could be the team to get the bye and not the Mountain West. Yep. So not only do they want to win, but it would be great for these teams to get a bye as well.
Definitely would be big. And I think we're both in agreement there. I think if Boise State does win, I ultimately do believe that they deserve the first round bye over the Big 12 champion, just given how the season's gone thus far.
Yeah, I'm with you. So yeah, we talked about Georgia, Texas, Penn State, Oregon. I like Oregon in this game. I think that Penn State has had they've had, along with Texas, kind of a easier path to get to the playoff. This is going to be a big test for them. They put up a great fight against Ohio State, though.
They put up a really good fight against Ohio State. Definitely a tougher fight than Indiana did. Indiana, of course, sitting there in a spot to potentially make the playoffs here. It looks like they're in. But for Penn State, I feel like there's more on the line in this game just to prove how legit of a program they are. Losing close or winning would say a lot in terms of what they can do in the playoffs. You get an opportunity to play the number 1 team in the country who has a 60th strength of schedule in Oregon, but you get a chance to play them, show the country what you're able to do at a neutral site taking place in Indianapolis. We'll see. Drew Allar is kind of not been as respected as probably Penn State fans want him to be. This Penn State defense is pretty solid, and we'll see what they can do against Oregon. Yeah, I feel like Dan Lanning right now is on a mission. I'm not going to lie.
He is. Yeah. It felt like there was that last year. Like he had that drive in him to get it, just couldn't get it done against Washington. And now this year he has the best path now from here on forward. Like if he can get past this game, you're the 1 seed with a bye. It's a good setup for him.
It's definitely a good setup for him. So those are some of the main conference championship games. Of course, we have the Conference USA, we talked about the Mountain West and the MAC. Those aren't necessarily going to affect the, from a playoff perspective, what's going to happen. And I don't think any of those teams have actually played any of the playoff teams, maybe besides Ohio. I want to say they played Ohio State, but there's not a ton from the MAC and Conference USA when it comes to how it affects the playoffs this year.
Yeah, Alabama, Western Kentucky.
All right,
so that could be one more to boost Alabama's resume, which we'll talk a lot more about that resume here in a second. But Clemson, SMU, the last game here to just kind of hit on is it's one where both teams could make it, one team could make it. This is the one that's up in the air of what happens to the loser in the game. We know the loser of Iowa State, Arizona State won't make it. We know the loser of UNLV, Boise State won't make it, but the loser of this game could still make it if it is SMU. So this is one to keep an eye on. We talked about it before. Alabama fans will be watching this one too pretty closely.
Yep. That's definitely, to me, like when I asked the original question of which game is most interesting to you outside of the SEC, I think it's obvious, right? Clemson, SMU, out of the Power Four conference championships. You touched on the Big 12 one. I think that one's interesting. You touched on the SEC one. Of course, we talked about that earlier, but the Clemson SMU one is interesting because it's like if SMU wins, if everything looks the way it is today, Alabama gets in. If Clemson wins, the committee is going to have to make a decision on what you do with SMU compared to the rest of the pool, the teams that are not playing this weekend that are, for some reason, their tickets look punched, the Ohio States, the Indianas, the Tennessees. And, it also depends how SMU, if they were to lose, how they lose. It seems like that's kind of been the talk of what could happen in terms of the rankings and where things fall. And so to me, that's the most interesting conference championship game outside of the SEC for those reasons.
Yeah, absolutely. So that wraps up kind of the conference games. I think we should get into some bracket talk. There's a lot to talk about. A lot of narratives out there around who should be in the playoff. Is it Alabama? Is it Miami? Is it Ole Miss? Is it South Carolina? I know South Carolina has been the favorite of the media, of fans to get that last spot. We saw the playoff show
Heisman.
we saw the playoff show yesterday night, Tuesday night, and Alabama is the one that got the nod of those four teams. A lot of people not super happy about it. I know we kind of differ on our thoughts there. So let's get into it. What are your initial thoughts on the way that they seeded some of these teams?
Yeah, just based upon how they initially seeded the teams, I think, so this is the first time we did brackets and buzz. This is the most I've ever spent the time looking at the 12 seed or the 11 spot, right? And to me, it felt like from 1 to 5, they focused on a combination of strength and record and strength of schedule. Strength of record favors Texas. Strength of schedule favors some of the other Big Ten teams. We talked about Oregon having the number 60 strength of schedule. Once you get to the latter half of the rankings, we saw Indiana and SMU behind the Georgias, the Tennessees, the Ohio States. I understand Indiana being behind Ohio State since they lost to them. I'm not fully on board with them being behind Tennessee, given that they're showing the strength of record matters more for a team like Texas and Oregon compared to an Indiana. And then once we get to the back half, ultimately Miami has a better record, but Alabama has more ranked wins. Ranked wins are determined by the committee who ranks the teams. And then Miami, of course, they're sitting there around 0-1 or 0-2 in terms of ranked teams or teams that are above 500. So those are a couple of my thoughts. What are your thoughts?
My thoughts, honestly, I think that the four teams from 11 to 14 are in the proper order. I think that Alabama, I think that no team of these four deserves to be in a playoff for college football. This has been expanded to where one team has to make it. None of them deserve it, but in a 12 team, someone has to be that team. And if you put all the criteria together from the committee, I think that Alabama is the team that fits the most of that. They have the most ranked wins. They do have some bad losses on there, but so do Ole Miss, so does South Carolina, so does Miami. Not as bad, but they haven't played the level of talent that these other teams have. So there's nothing to point at to say that Miami's boosted their resume with other teams. So I'm looking at these four, the strength of schedule favors Alabama. South Carolina was always going to be behind Ole Miss and Alabama in my mind because of head-to-head. I know there was that push for them, but head-to-head has to matter no matter how early in the season it was.
I agree. Your full resume has to matter. And, we did the power rankings part of our episode on Sunday. We published it. Thank you for everyone that watched it. Yes, South Carolina looks better. Yes, they have more quality wins, but the full resume, your full schedule has to matter. If you take a class, just because you failed a test in the first half of the year, but you ultimately pass all your other tests, you still get a B, right? And that's where Alabama right now is able to get that B plus to get a higher rating in this class score, especially with the head-to-head scores there. I think that makes sense. And to me, it's like if you put South Carolina above Alabama, you're setting a really bad precedent that games on the field don't matter. If their records were the same fully, I would understand.
Yeah. If South Carolina was 9-2,
If South Carolina had one less loss, it would be a little different. I apologize there.
Yeah. If South Carolina was 10-2 and Alabama was 9-3, put them ahead. They'd have better. But now you have two teams 9-3, and I've seen the argument about Oklahoma often that South Carolina beat Oklahoma, Alabama lost to them. It works the other way for LSU, regardless of what the whistle, the yellow flag on the field says about that hit to end that game. But Alabama beat LSU, who beat South Carolina. They have the direct head-to-head. So to me, the conversation was always between Alabama and Miami. you could put Ole Miss into that conversation as well, but they have a much worse loss. We're dinging Alabama, and people are hating on Alabama for the loss to Oklahoma or a loss to Vanderbilt. Ole Miss lost to Kentucky, who is essentially, from a power ranking standpoint, I think the last ranked team in the SEC. They did get a win there. So it was always between Alabama and Miami to me. Everything aside from the win-loss record favors Alabama. Resume, opponent win percentage, strength of schedule. It's unfortunate for Miami that it played out this way, because there is a world where Florida could have been better, where Louisville could have been better, Duke
Florida State could be better.
Florida State could have been better.
Yep.
It just
and you
didn't
can't control. It didn't play out that way, and I talked over you, so I apologize. You can't control fully who's on your schedule and how well they perform, right? We're seeing that with Indiana as well. And, bringing it back to that final playoff spot conversation, because that was the majority of the dialogue that was being discussed on the college football playoff ranking show on Tuesday night. To me, it's like the ACC, given their strength of schedule, according to the SOS and how it's calculated, opponent win percentage and their opponent's win percentage, it feels like they have less of a margin for error compared to the SEC. And so a lot of people are upset that Alabama's, like you mentioned, are able to lose to a Vanderbilt. They're able to lose to Oklahoma. And yet we watch Georgia Tech go toe-to-toe with Georgia, who is playing in the SEC championship, and Miami feels to be more penalized because they lost. I get it. It's a loss versus a almost loss for Georgia. They appear to be more penalized for that than the likes of other conferences and other teams. And so for me, it's tough to see a 10-2 team in that spot compared to a 9-3 team, although the majority of the data points point to it. And then from the ranked wins perspective, the committee decides who they rank. So I could see Duke, who's 9-3, being ranked. They're one of the few 3-loss teams right now from a Power 4 conference not ranked. That would help their resume. Louisville has a number 22 strength of schedule. They're not ranked either. They'd be the only 8-4 conference ranked team, but it would help Notre Dame. It would help SMU. It would help Miami as well. So just something to think about when it comes to how their record looks against the top 25.
For sure. And then, I completely agree with your point that those teams could be ranked. With that, though, even if those two teams were ranked, even if Duke and Louisville were ranked, they still wouldn't have the same amount of ranked wins as Alabama. They would have still one less loss, but the point being that the resume of the teams that they've played, they had less opportunities to prove themselves because they played less good teams that Alabama did, which means that there's less room for error. You have to prove yourself to be a stronger team with less data points, because you're playing a Florida State when that should have been a good game when it's not. Alabama could say the same thing about why LSU isn't going to be one of their ranked wins because of the slide that LSU had. That was something going into the year. That was one of the key data points for Alabama. So they could say that too about teams that have slipped out since they've played them. With that, the eye test, I think that favors South Carolina. Win-loss favors Miami. But if you put the entire resume together, I think it's Alabama. I think if you put the entire thing together. Now, Ole Miss, I think, has a case to it, but the committee doesn't have a huge, they've pointed out that they're not really looking at point differential and comparative wins. So that Georgia beating, or Ole Miss beating Georgia by more points than Alabama did isn't a huge factor. So that's just something to think about. But, there's a lot of people aren't going to be happy. It could be 20 teams, 21 will be upset.
Yeah. And you're right there with you, right? There could be 20 teams, 21 would be upset. And, I think a lot of people expected to see with this expanded playoff more parity. I think we talked about it before we recorded. More parity, more non-blue bloods. And for the most part, it's all blue bloods besides SMU and Indiana. SMU getting a benefit because they're now in a Power 4 conference. I was looking at an article from ESPN, I think came out in July. SMU is actually slated to have one of the easiest Power 4 schedules in the country. And obviously that can change as the games go on and as they their opponents play other opponents. They get the nod because they're in a Power 4 conference. Indiana's getting that nod because they're in a Power 4 conference. There's still a spot guaranteed for the G5, given they take 5 conference champs. There's only 4 Power 4 teams. But to your point, someone's going to be upset. And I think a lot of the reaction is coming from the fact that there's people that probably just don't like Alabama. Because I can sit here and I can argue for Miami. I can make a case for South Carolina, but when you look at the full body of work, they do have more ranked wins. The rankings are controlled by the committee. Talked about that earlier. But from a full resume, I could see why they picked Bama. I think people are just upset because now you're looking at the playoffs. If the season was to end today, it's 33% Big Ten, 33% SEC. So 66% of the playoffs out of 144 FBS teams are coming from two conferences.
Yeah.
I don't know what the fix is there. If there needs to be one, the SOS and the ranked ones don't say there is, but it feels like the margin of error is different for certain teams. And some reasons it's justified, some it's not.
Yeah, but I mean, looking at the ACC compared to the SEC, the two teams playing in the ACC championship, Clemson has lost both their games to the SEC.
Yep.
SMU is now playing; they lost their game to the Big 12. So the ACC's top two dogs have lost games to the other conferences. Mm-hmm. So they're not necessarily proving to be one of the premier conferences. So that's why there's more of some of these teams of other conferences, because while there's a weaker schedule for Indiana, it's still a conference that is playing tough games. They're still playing Washington, Michigan, where you have, UNLV playing Colorado State, who's a weaker team on Texas' schedule, but then they needed a tune-up game. So it's an interesting, what's the fix? I think when it expanded to 12, they expected to see more teams get in, and now they're upset that you're still seeing the same teams get in.
Yeah.
There was always going to be a 3-loss team. I mentioned this to you. Every year since college football playoff has started, there's been a 3-loss team inside the top 12 at the end of the year, except for 2023. And that's number 8 Utah in 2022, number 8 Wisconsin in 2016, not SEC teams. 7 Florida, 7 Auburn. So there was 3-loss teams making their way in. So this isn't an anomaly to expect a 3-loss team to get a playoff spot when it was expanded to 12.
And it's not an anomaly, but a lot of those teams you do mention were conference champions. And so when you think about the format in the past, they pretty much put 12 teams there to satisfy that New Year's Six bowl. So in order to be in the New Year's Six, you had to be in the top 12. And if you won your conference, you have to be in the top 12. So you and in past formats in 2 divisions, you can get into the conference championship with 3 losses and you could win it. We saw it when Utah beat USC a couple of years ago with Caleb Williams. And so I'm not saying every single team you mentioned benefited from that format, but I think that played a role in seeing Auburn where they were, and in seeing where Utah was in LSU in the past when they had Burrow and they played against UCF in the Fiesta Bowl as well. Just some couple data points that I remember from what you mentioned there.
Yeah, it's just when you expand out, there's going to be teams at this point, especially in a year this year where we're seeing a lot of parity. So there was going to be a 3-loss team. Yeah. It's tough that it has to be an Alabama team who has some really, really bad losses on their resume. I think South Carolina is the team that I'm an Alabama fan. I think South Carolina would have been the eye test, most fun team from a fan perspective, from a who's playing the best football right now perspective. But that just, if we're using that level of subjectivity in a year where Alabama was better, if they did that same thing for Alabama and said they're the best team, they should just be in, that people wouldn't be happy with that. It's fun now when it's South Carolina to have that conversation, but there needs to be a level of subjectivity removed. And I think that by looking at strength of schedule, a computer-based thing, record versus top 25, a factual-based thing, there is some subjectivity with who is ranked. I saw that the BCS model ran this, and it was the same top 12 aside from South Carolina would have been 12 instead of Miami, but Alabama would have still been in the top 12 with the BCS model.
Which is, it's interesting. The BCS model, I've seen some people calling for that to come back. Like you mentioned, and I'm going to wrap my point at least. It's a debate for who gets the last spot. On one hand, you could say that no one deserves it. On the other hand, someone's getting in, someone's getting the playoff money, someone gets a chance to ultimately compete for that national championship. And you want that spot, right? You win your games. You don't let the committee control your destiny, because Alabama's still in a spot where they don't fully control their destiny. Miami would be in the same spot where they don't control their destiny. Rounding out the top 25, I think the committee mostly got it right. Ultimately, I feel like BYU should be higher, given they've beat SMU. I talked about that earlier. Sometimes you see things that make you shake your head, like Missouri's still ranked despite not beating any of the good teams on their schedule. They probably have a great SOS, but you're not beating any of the teams. So if you're the ACC, do you just schedule better teams and bank on a loss? I guess that's kind of where Clemson's at. They scheduled a tough Georgia. They lost. And now because the conference appears to be pretty easy, they're in the conference championship. The other side, I would say that, Syracuse should be ahead of UNLV. It doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of what's going to happen in the Mountain West Championship. To me, it just kind of makes me question a little bit of what the committee saw there or what they watched.
Yeah, I think BYU should be higher. I think Clemson should be further down. I do think that there's potential to get one of those other ACC teams in there. But from a scheduling standpoint, I think that you need to schedule some tougher games within your conference, because that's what's working so well for the SEC, is that you're saying Georgia beat Texas, but Alabama beat Georgia, but Tennessee beat Alabama. You're able to do this round robin, mental math to get to the point of saying that all of these teams have done something to earn it. If this was a schedule where Miami played SMU and Miami lost to SMU and didn't lose to Georgia Tech, I think that Miami would be in because they'd have a better loss on their resume. They didn't even have to win a better game.
Yeah.
Because of them having better games scheduled. So I think you have to schedule good games. There was no telling that SMU was going to be this team this year. They thought that was probably going to be Florida State, the winner of the conference last year, and it was not. So yeah, I think you just have to schedule games because the top 3 teams in the ACC didn't play each other.
They didn't, right? In SMU, they won the American Athletic last year, but they lost to Boston College in the bowl game. They were playing Preston Stone at quarterback. I would imagine he's in the portal here soon, but they have Kevin Jennings now, and they're playing a lot better. They probably didn't expect them to be in that conference championship discussion, and here they are, highest ranked team in the ACC. When we look at the playoff bracket, on one hand, it feels like it's like, why are we doing this when we know it's going to change? On the other hand, it's interesting. Let's be serious. It's fun. Which of these matchups excite you the most?
Alabama, Notre Dame. It's a run it back from 2013. It would be a tough game. A lot of people have been touting that, SEC having to go play a tough game in the cold in December is a tough thing to ask for. And this would be one of those games where Alabama's going to play at Notre Dame. This is one where it could not change. Like, this could be one that also stays because we don't have Notre Dame playing in a game, Alabama not playing in a game, depending on what happens with the spots around them.
Yeah, it really just depends on what happens with the spots around them. And, if you're a Notre Dame or Alabama fan and we say SMU wins this game, if you're watching this, you can see the bracket. SMU would play the winner of Alabama and Notre Dame based upon how the committee has ranked these teams to date. Do you like that matchup if you're Notre Dame or you're Alabama?
I think that this is I think that right now, really, Penn State probably has the best run, but I think that Alabama has the next best one to play Notre Dame and SMU. I wouldn't want to be Georgia having to play Indiana and then playing Texas for a third time, or Ohio State having to play Tennessee and then Oregon, or Tennessee having to play Ohio State and Oregon. So I do think this is a decent draw for Alabama. I think it's a decent draw for Notre Dame. They're both beatable teams. So they're looking at each other knowing that there's a potential there to do so.
Definitely. I like the game that excites me the most is definitely the Ohio State-Tennessee matchup. 2 blue bloods, Nico versus Will Howard. What can this Ohio State defense do against Dylan Sampson? Does Tennessee have an answer for the dual running back threat of Quinshon Judkins and Trayvon Henderson? I like that matchup a lot. I think the debate this week prior to the rankings was, should Ohio State be ranked higher or Tennessee? I think the committee got it right. Ohio State has more quality ranked wins than Tennessee does, but this Tennessee team, they're interesting. I don't know which Nico I'm going to get sometimes, but I do know what I'm going to get from Dylan Sampson. I do know what I'm going to get from that defense, and so it'd be a fun matchup to see what they can do against Will Howard and that team.
Yeah, for sure. And I think in this one, either team, I can see either team winning this game. I like Tennessee in this game. They've faltered, against Georgia recently, but Ohio State losing to Michigan, so either team could show something different in their worst side, or they could show their best side. But the ranking of it does matter a ton, because playing that game in Columbus versus playing that game in Neyland is huge. Like, so that difference of which one is ahead of the other, I think, is one of the biggest seeding when you're looking at the top 12 teams, one of the biggest seeding conversations that they had to have.
Definitely. And it involves 2 teams that are not playing here, on this upcoming conference championship weekend. Like I said on the last episode, I feel like Ohio State made out like a bandit. Losing to Michigan might have been one of the best things they could have done. Obviously, you negate the opportunity for a first round bye, but you don't have to play Oregon for a second time. You don't have another data point for people to point to and say, hey, you're legit or you're not legit. And Penn State's in the opposite spot. So, and Penn State gets to play Arizona State. I kind of like Arizona State in that matchup a little bit. I feel like they could maybe pull off some magic there in State College.
Yeah, I think so too. I absolutely think so. Arizona State's been playing some good football lately.
What do we do with Notre Dame in terms of, should we expect them to schedule an extra game? Like, they don't have an opportunity for another loss.
But why schedule a tougher game? Because I think the committee has shown, to their fault, that if you just go undefeated, as long as you're not an Army or something, or just playing some really, really, really weak strength of schedule, if you can get one loss, you're going to be in. So if you're, Alabama, if you're Penn State, if you're one of these teams, if you had the easiest schedule possible, as long as you only lose one game, and
Right.
you're good. Now you lose 2, you run the risk of being a Miami that gets kicked
Yep.
out because you did an easy schedule or you had an easy schedule.
BYU as well, right? Like,
BYU.
once they got their second loss, you can't afford the second loss if your SOS is not favorable in statistically. And then the ranked wins is ultimately subjective based upon how they think your conference looks, who they rank, right? Last week, the Big 12 had like 4 ranked teams in the bottom 20. So like, if you beat them, they fall out. If you lose, you fall out. It was a lose-lose situation. But they're showing that if you have that weaker SOS according to the stats, you have to go 1 loss or perfect to stay in those spots. So for all the people that are listening to this that don't love the SEC, thank you for tuning in. And for the people that do love it, you're seeing that you have a larger margin of error according to the committee this year compared to other conferences. And in some ways, I think that's fair. In other ways, I think it's a case-by-case basis. So.
Yeah, all schedules aren't created equal, so there has to be some sort of context provided to those things. So
yeah, absolutely. Any closing thoughts here, final thoughts when it comes to the rankings, conference championship weekend, the hypothetical bracket, the playoff odds per team?
I guess I want to ask you real quick, if SMU loses this game, do you think that they're in? Just personally, do you put SMU in if they lose to Clemson?
I feel like the SOS, which they're sitting, I think, below 50.
77.
77. I think you said earlier 77, right? The SOS
75.
doesn't favor 75, right? The SOS doesn't favor them. Although it's still better or close to what Boise State's is, but with another loss, I think the right decision in my mind would be to put SMU in. I don't see how it's fair that they played an extra game and they're penalized, and there's multiple teams that can sit at home and get in that have 2 losses. I get that those teams like Ohio State have better wins. Tennessee, it's like they have 1 better win. I think SMU should get in. What do I think the committee will do? I think the committee will do the right thing. I think they'll put them in.
Okay. Yeah, it would be a conversation, I guess, then between Alabama with 3-1 to top 25, SMU 0-2 to top 25. So they wouldn't have a ranked win at that point should they lose to Clemson. I completely agree with you where you can't penalize a team for playing on Saturday. I told someone, I was like, SMU should just say the bus broke. Like, we're not going to this game. Like, the bus broke down. We couldn't make it because you're in if you don't play.
You're in if you don't play.
Playing hurts you potentially.
It hurts you, right? And I don't have that same argument for Clemson because they have the 3rd loss. They have the 2 losses against the SEC. Like, because the ACC kind of had this cannibalization type year, Clemson gets in. Miami has historically choked in these positions. So all shade or no shade, however you want to take it for Miami, they have choked in these positions. I feel the same way as you do. I like morally, I just don't see how a 1 team can play football and lose, be the first place team, and then make another spot for a team that's sitting at home. In the way that the championships are set up this year, with most teams being the top, most divisions, most conferences not having divisions. Oh my God.
Yeah, I had to get that question out because I'm very curious as to what would happen. I don't want it to happen because I want to see Alabama in as an Alabama fan. But yeah, so I think that kind of wraps it. I don't think I have any other thoughts. I mean,
I got a question for you then, because we could do this all day. Which 2 at-large teams, if it's as it stands today, which is what it looks like it's going to be for the actual playoff revealing, which 2 at-large teams do you think have the best opportunity to win a national championship?
From the teams that would be at the back, like I'm not counting, are you saying from all 12? Or are you saying just the ones that could get in that last spot? Alabama, Miami, SMU.
I'm saying all 12. All 12.
Oh, all 12. I think probably Oregon. It's just they haven't lost yet. It's hard.
In the event they lose, in the event they lose the national, or they lose the conference championship, they would be the best at-large team.
Yeah, they would be the best at-large team. I think from all the non-conference champions, should they lose that game, I think it would be the loser of the SEC probably has the best chance after that. Like, I do like Texas. Even if they lose to Georgia again, I still think that Texas any given day. I think that Georgia any given day. They lost those games on the road. So Georgia losing to Alabama on the road, they put up a good fight to come back in that one. I do think that Georgia could potentially do it.
Yeah.
So yeah.
I like the Georgia pick or the Texas pick depending on who loses that game. I mean, if I'm looking outside of that, I feel like Ohio State could bounce back to find themselves in a spot. It would be historical for Ryan Day. But I think the sting of those 2 losses this season, If they somehow match up again against Oregon, it's tough to beat a team twice. You get past Oregon, you're going to play either Boise State or you're going to play Penn State, according to how the bracket is now. I think that puts them in a better spot to get to the national championship. But it's all hypotheticals, right?
Yeah.
This could change once we get the final bracket and how these teams look in the conference championship week. I mean, never want to see this happen, but injuries happen as well. So a lot could change before we get to our final bracket and our first playoff games starting December 20th. So in 16 days.
Yeah. I mean, it's all hypotheticals now. The committee's at least shown us what they care about. So after Saturday, we can look and we'll record and say what we think is going to happen come Tuesday, but there's really no telling. And until then, it's all up in the air, whether it will be in Alabama, whether it'll be SMU, whether Clemson can get in. We'll see on Saturday. So this was a fun one to talk about. Just so much conversation going on online about everyone's opinions and feelings about it. It's no one was ever going to be happy with the 12 team. If it could have been a 30 team playoff, 31 will be upset. So it's just one of those things.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things. I mean, I've seen South Carolina fans do gymnastics to figure out like how they have the best case to get in. Miami was trying to make the best case. Alabama was kind of sitting there calmly, knowing that things could probably wind up their way, but still watching this weekend very closely for that 8 p.m. game, Eastern, 7 p.m. Central, if you're in Alabama. But such a fun season. The conversation on Twitter has been great, or X. The conversation in the forums has been great. I saw some funny stuff on one of the Ohio State forums talking about what they could do in terms of Ryan Day's contract. This is what we love about college football, just the madness, the craziness. And we finally are at the point where the bracket is just about 90% done. So we'll see what happens on Saturday. For everyone that watched here, thank you for tuning in. If you haven't subscribed yet, like I mentioned, please do. We're coming with you with previews, game recaps, our Brackets and Bros-esque talking about the playoff brackets on the format. And until next time, I'm Randall Jr. We've got Hunter Zeisman here, and that's it.